One evening, Percy was bringing empty stone trucks from the harbour. He was tired of his quarrel with Thomas and wanted to be friends again. He had had a good day and was feeling extra pleased with himself. He was so busy thinking how he would tell Thomas and Toby about his expert handling of the trucks that he forgot to keep a good lookout. Too late, he saw a broken branch hanging over the line straight in front of him. "Ooh, he groaned. He tried to stop, but his brakes wouldn't hold him. "Ouch!" he exclaimed a moment later. The branch hit his smoke box, broke away and crashed to the ground. Percy was more startled than hurt, but his front was still sore when they reached the shed. "It's your own fault," said Thomas unsympathetically. "You should keep a better lookout. I've no patience with you." "Pooh," retorted Percy huffily. He forgot his good resolution and talked to Toby for the rest of the evening. Percy didn't speak to Thomas the next day either. "I say, Toby," he said in the shed that evening, "what's a drip? Do you know?" Toby pondered. "It's when rain comes through a hole in your cab and fireman hasn't got time to mend it," he decided at last. "That's silly," objected Percy. "I heard a boy on the platform call his friend one this afternoon. I'm sure he couldn't have come through a hole in my cab," he added earnestly. Thomas was tired of being ignored. "That's different," he interrupted loftily. "The boy just thought his friend was being a coward, or silly, or a spoilsport." Percy thought about this. "So if," he suggested reflectively, "if you stopped me from doing something nice, would you be a drip, Thomas?" "You're the drip," answered Thomas crossly. "Now go to sleep like a sensible engine and stop talking nonsense." Percy was offended. Instead of going to sleep, he became even more determined to pay Thomas out. Next day, Henry's train was late at the junction. When Thomas set out along the valley, he was trying to make up for lost time. Suddenly, there was a loud bang and something hard hit the bottom of his left-hand water tank. "Ouch!" exclaimed Thomas and stopped. As he did so, he felt water splashing cold against his wheels. "One of your side rods has broken," said his driver. "It's swung up and punctured your tank. We'll have to get help." At Farquhar, Percy was shunting. The station master came up. "Leave those trucks, please, Percy," he said. "Thomas has got a hole in his water tank. There's water dripping everywhere, and he can't get home on his own." Percy was still cross with Thomas. "I won't go," he said. "Thomas called me a drip. Let him jolly well stay there and drip himself." "But what about Annie and Clarabelle and the passengers?" reminded Percy's driver. "Do they deserve to stay out all night too?" Percy was sorry at once. "I forgot them," he said. "We must rescue them in case they turn into drips too." He hurried away. He found Thomas near the river. Everyone was glad to see him, and the passengers thanked him for coming. "I'm sorry I was rude," said Thomas as Percy helped him back to the shed. "That tank of mine turned me into a bigger drip than we expected, didn't it? Can we be friends again, please?" Percy was delighted to agree. resting in the siding. It was a hot day and the express had been heavy. "I get so out of breath," he complained, "but nobody cares. They just say I'll be all right after a rest." "Get the Fat Controller to give you tanks and a bunker," suggested Thomas cheekily. "You'll feel a new engine. We tank engines never get out of breath, you know." Perhaps it was lucky for Thomas that poor Gordon hadn't the energy to reply. The men worked hard on Gordon, but they couldn't make him better. "You need new tubes, Gordon," they said. "You'll have to go to the works to have them fitted." While Gordon was being mended, Henry pulled the express. But one morning, just before Gordon was due back, Henry was ill too. "We've no spare engine except Thomas," the inspector told the Fat Controller, "but he can't pull the train on his own." "Could Percy help?" asked the Fat Controller. The inspector shook his head. "The two of them with Duck might manage," he suggested. "It's only as far as the works. They're sure to have a spare engine there." So the three tank engines were coupled together, Thomas nearest the train, Duck in the middle, and Percy at the front. Then, slowly, they started. Come on," fussed Percy importantly. We're doing it, puffed Duck. Pull harder," grumbled Thomas to the others. The heavy train drew out of the platform. The engines couldn't go as fast as Gordon, but the passengers didn't mind. They knew that Percy, Thomas and Duck were doing their best. Expresses are not like branch line trains. They don't stop at all the stations, and the engines don't have a chance to get their breath back. Soon the three began to feel tired. They struggled valiantly up Gordon's hill, but the strain was beginning to tell. "I'm glad we didn't stick there," thought Thomas. "Gordon would never have let us hear the last of it." But the hill proved too much for Percy. His driver blew his whistle and stopped the train. "We can't take you off, Percy," said Thomas's driver. "Do the best you can to keep your brakes off. It's not far now." This made things harder for the other two, but they struggled gamely on, twin columns of steam shooting high into the air. We're nearly there, puffed Thomas and Duck together as they summoned a last brave effort. Poor Percy had no steam left to say anything. They were just passing the works when Duck found he could go no further. Thomas could not pull the heavy train on his own, and the cavalcade came to a standstill a few yards short of the station platform. And there, standing watching from the works siding, stood Gordon. The Fat Controller, who'd been on the train, told the three engines he was proud of them. "You did very well to get so far," he said, "and now you deserve a rest." Duck, Percy and Thomas were uncoupled, and a new engine took their place. As the tank engines moved wearily away, Gordon looked at Thomas and smiled. Then he took 3 deep breaths and winked. He didn't need to say anything. Thomas knew exactly what he meant. Henry found life boring at the works. The men worked hard to make him better, but it seemed ages before he was ready. At last, however, when he had passed the test to make sure he was mended properly, men came to repaint him. But Henry saw that instead of nice green paint, they had something very different in their paint pots. "That's not right," protested Henry. "The Fat Controller wants me to be green with red stripes, not red all over like tomato sauce." The painters laughed. "You'd look very handsome, Henry," they said, "but don't worry, this paint is a special sort of undercoat. You shall have proper green with red stripes before we've finished." "Undercoat," muttered Henry in disgust. "Whatever would the other engines say if they saw me looking like this?" The men laughed and carried on painting. Early next morning his driver came. "Wake up, Henry," he said. "There's an emergency at the big station, and the Fat Controller says you're to help." "But I can't go like this," exclaimed Henry. "They'd all laugh like anything." "No choice," said his driver. "The diesel pulling the express has failed, and the Fat Controller needs you to take over. It's either us or a long walk for the passengers, and you know the Fat Controller wouldn't like that." The fireman raised steam as quickly as he could, and Henry, blushing with embarrassment, set off for the big station. The Fat Controller was pleased to see him. "I feel so silly looking like this," complained Henry. The Fat Controller laughed. "You do look unusual, Henry," he agreed, "but you have helped me out of a very awkward situation, so don't worry about it." But Henry did worry. Soon, too soon for Henry, it was time to start. The express was heavy, and Henry felt the drag of the coaches. "We'll need help on Gordon's Hill today," remarked his driver. But they were in trouble earlier than that. As they approached Edward Station, the brakes went wrong on the last coach of the train, and they had to stop and uncouple it. To make matters worse, Donald, who should have been there to help, had been called away. Henry had to push the coach into a siding himself, and, without Donald, there was no one to help him on the hill. "Never mind," comforted his driver. "You can do it. You're an enterprising engine, remember." Henry snorted. He didn't feel very enterprising just then. The men at the works had mended Henry well. His driver gave him as good a start as he could. It was hard going, but now Henry felt fired with determination. "Let them laugh at my red paint," he snorted. "I'll show them." Slowly he struggled upwards. "I can do it! I can do it! I can do it!" he panted. "Oh dear, will the top never come?" Then, suddenly, there it was. "I've done it! I've done it! I've done it!" he puffed proudly. After that, it was much easier, and they reached the other railway quickly. The Fat Controller, who had been on the train, came to congratulate Henry. "Well done, Henry," he said. "I'm very proud of you. Perhaps all my engines should be painted red, but you have certainly earned your proper green with red stripes." Which, of course, is just what Henry got. And when he at last returned to the shed, there was a warm welcome for Henry the Green Engine. Excited. "The diesels at yon works," he announced, "say that on the other railway there are things called high-speed trains. They have a diesel engine at each end and can go at 125 miles an hour. Gordon snorted. "An engine at each end," he said scornfully. "There's only one of me, but I bet I can go as fast as those smelly boxes on wheels. Probably faster," he added. The others said nothing. They had heard Gordon's boasting before. Gordon was still bragging the next morning. "Speed's nothing to me," he said. "Why, one of my Doncaster cousins went at 126 miles an hour. I'll show these diesels a thing or two, just you wait and see. He puffed grandly towards the station. Gordon normally pulled the express, though Henry, James or Bear helped if Gordon was ill or away. Many visitors came to see the Fat Controller's railway. They often used the express, so it was usually full and heavy. There had been frost during the night, and now the weather was wet and sleety. Sleet settled on the rails, making an icy film across their surface. The carriages of the express stood under the cover of the station roof, but when Gordon was coupled to them, his cabin front end had to stand outside. He grew colder and colder as he waited for the guard to blow his whistle and wave his green flag. "Come on," he shivered impatiently. "Let's get started." At last Gordon heard the whistle. "Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on," he shouted as he tried to pull quickly away. But his wheels slipped on the icy rails. The sudden movement made water in his boiler surge forward, and Gordon's driver could not shut off steam. Gordon moved a yard and slithered to a standstill, held back by the heavy train. His wheels spun furiously, but neither Gordon nor his train budged an inch. "Help! Help!" wailed Gordon despairingly, but nobody could. His wheels spun until his rods ached, but he could do nothing to stop them. His driver tried every trick he knew. An inspector came and tried some more, but it was no good. The Fat Controller came to see what the fuss was about. He said several things to Gordon, but Gordon was making so much noise that he couldn't hear them. Sparks showered from the rails. Gordon's wheels went on spinning. It was a quarter of an hour before Gordon had used up all his steam. Reduced pressure allowed the driver to close the regulator, and with a deep sigh of relief, Gordon felt his wheels stop turning. The silence was amazing. Donald came to take Gordon to the shed, and Henry came to pull the express. When the train had gone, workmen had to replace the rails where Gordon had been standing, because his spinning wheels had worn deep grooves in them. The shed was empty. Donald tactfully remembered another job and left Gordon on his own. But that night Gordon heard a whisper from close by. "Did you hear," it hissed, "how Gordon went for a spin today?" There was a quiet chuckle. Gordon seethed in silence. "High-speed engines are all very well," the whisper went on, "but Gordon ought to know by now that he's supposed to move his train too." Gordon snorted disgustedly, and with a gasp the whisperer subsided into silence.